Let's talk cluster bombs and Britney Spears. Again, you did hear that correctly. The Britney Cluster Index, or indeed the full Celebrity Cluster Index, is but one of several creative projects to be found on the Cluster Project, a site that seeks to raise awareness and promote honest, necessary conversations about our obsession and passive complicity with warfare, death, and destruction. I don't think that's a bomb. I spoke with Bob Paris, the creator of the site, and got some insight into the various projects, the cluster bomb issue, and more. Take a look.
It began with cluster projects because when I was first dreaming up this shit, a cluster bomb was one of the few recognizable bombs people could connect to. You know, it just sounds like cluster bomb, cluster fuck. People, it's in the popular mindset a little bit. And at the same time, cluster bombs were such a perfect example of a horrific bomb, not horrific in the extraordinary like damage it does, but the fact that 98% of cluster bomb victims' fatalities have been civilians. So I always felt like if you look at the cluster bomb and how it affects civilians, innocent people, how it affects kids, you could get a Republican housewife from Boise. If she understood it better, she wouldn't support it. She would want the U.S. to sign, you know, the ban on these weapons that most of the world has signed. So these are just things that somehow it's, you know, it's a challenge to the imagination. Why don't people really know about exactly how these weapons work and how indiscriminate and dangerous they might be? So it was just a great way of getting into the idea of kind of an alienated consciousness about warfare. And so that's one of the big issues that I've been dealing with and my collaborators have been dealing with. We live in America. It's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, military powers of all time. We spend more than the next 20 countries on defense, quote unquote, on weapons. We dream up and we build and we sell and we use the great preponderance of the world's weapons. Even for entertainment, we fantasize about weapons. And yet, somehow, we're very distant from the implications of what this warfare and these weapons are. So we're trying to figure out how do you pierce that alienation a little bit? Why do people not know or don't want to know? What's going on there? People are, you know, distracted, brainwashed, whatever. You know, they're involved with their daily lives that have no room for kind of global injustices. You know, why is that? And how do you start that process where you, how do you start this process of more empathy, more awareness? A great example of that one is the first one, The Gift That Keeps on Giving. I don't know if you saw that. That's one that Jeff made. And he had never made an animation before. And if you look at that sucker, I mean, it's really good. And what it is initially it was like, well, if we have a few projects on cluster bombs, and a few of them are on cluster bombs, you got to give a sense of what a cluster bomb is. So initially I'm thinking, okay, a written description. And then, of course, that's bad. So I was just thinking graphic images. And what we did was eventually now we have an animation that kind of tells a story that is a kind of primer on how they work that somehow transcended. It's informational, but it's actually a work of art. There's a few different hooks in it. So to me, that's a really great success illustrating that idea of being able to actually communicate something, but at the same time, you're kind of entertaining people. At the same time, there's a kind of creative depth to the work. So that's what you want. I mean, that's an ideal piece for me.
And I think that, you know, all of the videos and the pieces that I looked at had me at, and particularly the one that you mentioned, The Gift That Keeps on Giving, because some of the verbiage there says, you know, cluster bombs are patriotic and they're profitable. And so it got me wondering, okay, how do we, because you don't hear about cluster bombs in the news, you know, you hear about drones. And it got me wondering, like, do we still use cluster bombs? Is that still a thing that we do? And if so, where do we use them? Like, where are we dropping these these cluster bombs. I don't know if you've done research on that, and you could speak.
Yeah, well, you're almost bringing up old news a little bit because our focus is so much change, but I think I can address that without, briefly. We made a lot of the world's cluster bombs, and a lot of the world's cluster bombs are still, they're still in storehouses. I mean, they're still ready to go. And what's happened is, for the most part, we've stopped using our traditional models of cluster bombs that were created. And these are ones, for people that don't know, I guess you have to explain just for a moment what a cluster bomb is, because it's really a bunch of smaller bombs. And it's launched over kind of a wide area. It's a very imprecise bomb. So when it comes down, it's like, all this steel shrapnel hitting the ground at the same time. It's kind of called like a steel rain. But one of the great dangers of cluster bombs is it's one of those weapons that there's typically a lot of duds, a lot of bombs that don't go off, which should be really good. They don't go off. But the problem is they do go off eventually because they're like landmines. So traditionally, these are in rural areas. And for example, in Laos and Vietnam, there's still hundreds of thousands of these bombs that are still out there. So every week there's explosions. Every week there's kids who are inadvertently, getting hurt or getting killed by these bombs. This is 40 years after the war. So that's a very pernicious kind of weapon. And there's an international treaty for cluster bombs, just like there's an international treaty for landmines, and we have not signed it for a variety of reasons. So we have not signed it, nor has Pakistan, nor has Israel, nor has Russia, nor has China. All the usual suspects. Most of the civilized world have signed these things because there's really no useful end for these weapons anymore. But I think it's really important and kind of relevant. Like, as I said before, most of our projects right now are connected to drones. And I think the important thing is just starting to get a wider consciousness of the weapons that America makes and sells and uses, and our complicity with that. In the supposed democracy, we do have some kind of role or some kind of say or some kind of endorsement. So when our way of life or our tranquility depends on a nuclear missile being aimed at a grandmother and children in Vladivostok or something, it seems like those are just issues that deserve debate and discussion. But actually, we don't have those. We almost never have had that. Why is that? So one of the ideas we're just trying to do through Multimedia Works is creating pieces that eventually provoke consciousness, raise consciousness.
To learn more about their work and their upcoming projects focusing on drones and nuclear weapons, including a drone coloring book, check out clusterproject.com. Also, for any of you artists out there, they are always looking for collaboratives, so if you're interested in joining forces with this team, get in touch via the website. Interestingly enough, I had heard a little about the cluster bomb issue since 2008, when 111 countries met in Ireland to agree on banning cluster bombs. Of course, the US was predictably absent. And here's a possible reason why. Late last month, PRI's The World ran a story on US-made cluster bombs being used to bomb Yemen. Our friendly human rights violators, the Saudis, are apparently buying up a new kind of cluster bomb and using it to drop here and there and wherever throughout Yemen. Human Rights Watch has raised serious concerns and complaints about its usage, in particular a clause of the original sales agreement stating that cluster munitions will only be used against clearly defined military targets and will not be used where civilians are known to be present or in areas normally inhabited by civilians. But, as evidence proves, these cluster bombs are being used in areas of Yemen inhabited by civilians. When asked about the apparent sociopathic usage of their product, spokesperson for munitions company Textron wrote that his company does not comment on customer applications of our products in their military and security operations. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? Plead the fifth, you piece of shit. It's no wonder we want nothing to do with a cluster bombs ban. At $360,000 a pop, these sales are just another solid piece of that military-industrial complex pie. So what can you do about it? Well, besides sharing the Cluster Project site, check out Human Rights Watch at hrw.org and stopclustermunitions.org.